Welcome back. This is the third part of a multi-part presentation investigating the 70 weeks prophecy that Gabriel gave to Daniel. This is found in chapter 9 of the book of Daniel. In part 1, I dealt with the very well-known interpretation put forward by Sir Robert Anderson and modified by Harold Hoehner. I showed that their calculations are flawed and their assumptions of start dates are not accurate. I had to address this first, since so many accept this interpretation at face value without realizing that it cannot be correct. In part 2, I introduced the common problems and assumptions that many people bring to their attempts at understanding the prophecy. I compared the various English translations and showed how the translators had difficulty in determining the order of the time periods and their significance. I showed that the text of the original Hebrew language does not contain any capitalization of words nor any punctuation. Therefore, the translators introduce their personal biases into the wording that they use. This is especially evident in the King James Version of the text. I introduced the basic structure of the prophecy, that Gabriel laid out 3 distinct and separate periods of weeks, or 7 years. Since there are 3 distinct periods, that means that there are also 2 gaps included. Most people understand that there is at least 1 gap, but in reality there are 2, and these 2 gaps are themselves groups of 7 years, ones that have not been stated in the text. Now, I will get into the details of the prophecy, beginning with the first 7 weeks of years. I suspect that what I've presented so far has already been very difficult to process. It goes against how most people have come to understand the text, but there are many assumptions, and part of my goal is to challenge and investigate those assumptions. This will be done by continually going back to the original Hebrew language and determining the usage and meaning of the words that have been used. This is the secret of how to correctly interpret the passage that Gabriel specifically told Daniel to seal up. It's meant to be difficult until the time is right for it to be revealed. As we start investigating, I think it would be helpful to make sure we understand the historical context. Over the years, the kingdom of Israel developed into a powerful nation during the reign of King David and his son Solomon. After a civil war, the kingdom of Israel split into 2, with Israel to the north and Judah to the south. Around 600 BC, only the kingdom of Judah remained as the homeland of the Jewish people. Roughly 100 years prior, the northern kingdom of Israel had been conquered and taken into exile by the Assyrians, the ruling empire of the time. However, the Babylonian nation was on the rise and broke the Assyrian influence over the region in 609 BC and became the new ruling power. Over a period of years, and after several sieges, Jerusalem was destroyed and the majority of the population were deported into exile as well. In 539 BC, the Medo-Persians defeated Babylon and took their place as the new dominant empire of the region. Daniel had been taken into captivity after the first attacks by the Babylonians against Judah. During his lifetime in Babylon, he rose to very high prominence in the political circles. This was not of his doing, though. Over the years, he had received several prophetic visions and had trusted God for their proper interpretation. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, recognized the power of the God that Daniel trusted in and rewarded Daniel because of this. Years went by, and when the Babylonian Empire was defeated, Daniel began to take another look at the prophecies of Jeremiah. From his studies, he concluded that the time of the Jewish exile should be at an end. It was during a prayer of intercession on behalf of his people that the archangel Gabriel appeared to Daniel and outlined a prophecy concerning the future of the Jewish people in answer to his prayer. This takes place in the 9th chapter of Daniel. That is, in broad strokes, the time period. We'll get into more exact dates as we continue. After all, this prophecy is about time, and we have to study the historical details very carefully. Daniel begins the chapter by stating the prophecy was given in the first year of the reign of Darius the Mede. The Babylonian Empire was defeated by the Medes and Persians in 539 BC, so this is up to a year after that point. I, Daniel, perceived in the books the number of years that, according to the word of the Lord to Jeremiah the prophet, must pass before the end of the desolations of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. Daniel 9 verse 2. He was studying the various books or letters written by Jeremiah and realized that there was an allotted time period given. When it was finished, Jerusalem would no longer remain deserted and ruined. The period was 70 years. This verse already causes many a lot of problems when they don't carefully consider what the text is actually saying. Many state that Jerusalem would lie in a state of ruin for 70 years. That is not what the text says. At some point, a period of 70 years starts counting down. It is the end of this period that marks the conclusion of Jerusalem's judgment. When Jerusalem actually began its judgment is not the issue. It happened sometime within the 70 years. Historically, this can be shown since Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem in 586 BC. Many others assume that the entire period of the exile of the Jewish people in Babylon was 70 years. And this is what Daniel was referring to. Some Bible publishers even put headings into the text specifically stating 70 years of exile. Again, we have to be very exact in considering the details. First, very few of the Jewish population living in Babylon eventually returned to Jerusalem and to their homeland. So the idea that when the exile was over and they were allowed to return, then they all moved back is very much an error. Next, we have to examine the dates of when the deportations occurred to see what length of time can be considered. There were 3 times that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Judah and carried off a portion of the population. The first is listed in Daniel 1, 1-3. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility. This was in the 3rd year of Jehoiakim, which is dated to 605 BC. Only some of the population was affected, and it was mostly the nobility class. The farmers and the workers of the land were left intact. Note this, as this particular fact will be important as we continue. Judah became a vassal state. Jehoiakim endured this situation for 3 years and then rebelled against Babylon. They then faced many raids and attacks until finally he was chained and carted off to Babylon. Several years later, in 597 BC, his son, Jehoiachin, also faced a full-on siege from the Babylonian army. Nebuchadnezzar deported most of Jerusalem at this time, roughly 10,000. In 2 Kings 24:14 it says, "He carried away all Jerusalem and all the officials and all the mighty men of valor, 10,000 captives, and all the craftsmen and the smiths. None remained except the poorest people of the land." The next and final king, Hezekiah, also rebelled against Babylonian rule. Nebuchadnezzar finally had had enough and came one last time and besieged the city. And all the vessels of the house of God, great and small, and the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the king and of his princes, all these he brought to Babylon. And they burned the house of God and broke down the wall of Jerusalem and burned all its palaces with fire and destroyed all the precious vessels. He took into exile in Babylon those who had escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and to his sons until the establishment of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths. All the days that it lay desolate, it kept Sabbath, to fulfill 70 years. Only now, in 586 BC, were the majority of the population deported from the city and from the rest of Judah. Only now would the land no longer be worked and would lie fallow. Leviticus 26:34-35 says, "Then the land shall enjoy its Sabbaths as long as it lies desolate, while you are in your enemy's land. Then the land shall rest and enjoy its Sabbaths. As long as it lies desolate, it shall have rest, the rest that it did not have on your Sabbaths when you were dwelling in it." Notice that Leviticus states that the Sabbaths would be repaid when they were in their enemy's land. The majority of the population were forcibly removed in 586 BC, not 605, not 597, in 586. Those that state the period of 70 years shows that the Jewish population ignored 70 sabbatical years are in error. The entire land was desolate, starting only after Jerusalem's complete destruction. And this is also the problem with stating that the Jewish exile was 70 years long. One cannot find a period of 70 years starting from any of the deportations. And since the majority of the population wasn't even removed until 586, there is a major problem stating that the Babylonian exile was 70 years long. A lot of people give up at this point once these dates are fully understood, since they cannot be reconciled with their assumptions. But Daniel specifically mentions the time period of 70 years, and the author of 2 Chronicles 36 does too. So what exactly is that in reference to? Both verses tie the 70 years to something in the writings of Jeremiah. Jeremiah mentions 70 years twice, first in chapter 25 and then again in chapter 29. By examining these passages, we will discover exactly what Daniel was investigating and then reacted so strongly to. But also notice, Jeremiah does not mention the issue of missed sabbatical years even once in all of his writings. There is something else that is related to the 70 years. Jeremiah 29 contains a letter that he addresses to the exiles living in Babylon. Although Jeremiah lived in Jerusalem, God had a specific message for those who had already been forcibly removed during the time of King Jehoiachin in 597 BC. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon: build houses and live in them, plant gardens and eat their produce. For thus says the Lord, when 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will visit you, and I will fulfill to you my promise and bring you back to this place. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope. Then you will call upon me and come and pray to me, and I will hear you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and I will restore your fortunes and gather you from all the nations and all the places where I have driven you, declares the Lord, and I will bring you back to the place from which I sent you into exile. And that's Jeremiah 29, 4-5 and 10-14. God tells them to get settled in Babylon and to try to prosper during this time. It's God's will, so don't fight against it. But once the 70 years is over, God will remember his promise and allow them to return to their homeland. But notice, there is a requirement to seek after him with all their heart. It is certain that this letter is what Daniel had been studying. His long prayer is his act of obedience after reading the instructions contained within. Notice that in verse 10, the letter references God's promise. This is the word Davar, and this particular word is the secret to understanding the timeline of the first 7 weeks. But we're not quite there yet. Very likely, the other writings of Jeremiah had made their way to Babylon so that Daniel had access to them. Jeremiah 25 takes place during the first year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, which is around 605 BC. Jeremiah prophesies, "Yet you have not listened to me, declares the Lord, that you might provoke me to anger with the work of your hands to your own harm. Therefore thus says the Lord of hosts, because you have not obeyed my words, behold, I will send for all the tribes of the north, declares the Lord, and for Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant, and I will bring them against this land and its inhabitants, and against all the surrounding nations. I will devote them to destruction, and make them a horror, and a hissing, and an everlasting desolation. This whole land shall become a ruin and a waste, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Then after 70 years are completed, I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation, the land of the Chaldeans, for their iniquity, declares the Lord, making the land an everlasting waste." Notice that God's judgment is not only against the population of Judah, but also includes all the surrounding nations. All the nations will serve Babylon 70 years. And he states that when the 70 years is complete, the judgment against Babylon begins. Jeremiah does not state that it is a period of 70 years of exile. It is a time of God's judgment for all the surrounding peoples. Later on in chapter 25, Jeremiah states that God sent him to all the nations to give them this same prophecy. He went to Egypt, Uz, Philistia, Edom, Moab, Ammon, Tyre, Sidon, the kings of Arabia, and the wandering tribes, to Elam, Media, and the kings of the north. He went on a prophecy world tour. Everyone was made aware that the approaching difficult time was coming to God's chosen people at Jerusalem, but the rest of the nations would not escape his judgment either. The clamor will resound to the ends of the earth, for the Lord has an indictment against the nations. He is entering into judgment with all flesh, and the wicked he will put to the sword, declares the Lord. How many times have you heard anyone talk about this when they investigate Daniel's 70 weeks? Here is one of those things that people have not noticed, but is essential when considering the historical context. God specifically set out a period of time when he used Babylon as his instrument of judgment. He even calls Nebuchadnezzar his servant. This took place several years later. Jeremiah again was charged to send word to the surrounding nations. "It is I who by my great power and my outstretched arm have made the earth, with the men and the animals that are on the earth, and I give it to whomever it seems right to me. Now I have given all these lands into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant, and I have given him also the beasts of the field to serve him. All the nations shall serve him, and his son, and his grandson, until the time of his own land comes. Then many nations and great kings shall make him their slave." The 70 years are specifically tied to the time that Babylon subjugated Judah and the surrounding nations. It is a prophecy of exactly how long the Babylonian Empire would exist. Since the empire was conquered in 539 BC, then the beginning of the 70 years would be in 609 BC. Notice this year is before the deportation of Judah in 605 BC. So what happened in 609 BC? This was the year that the Babylonians defeated the remains of the Assyrian army. Babylon had captured and destroyed the Assyrian capital of Nineveh in 612. 3 years later, the remnants of the army and their Egyptian allies made their last stand at Haran. Babylon soundly defeated them, and as a result, they became the dominant power of the entire region. The 70-year countdown clock started at this point. So now we have the full context of what Daniel had experienced and where he found himself in 538 BC. The year before, Babylon had fallen to the Medes and Persians. This was after their empire had lasted 70 years. God's purpose was the judgment against Judah and all the surrounding nations. As a secondary result, after Jerusalem had been totally emptied and destroyed, the nation's farmland was left with no one to work the fields. It made up for all the missed sabbatical years during this time, an unspecified number of years. Although one can say it was roughly 50 years. 50 years, huh? That's pretty close to 7 weeks of years, right? What an interesting coincidence. In any case, Daniel could determine all these things once he fully understood what Jeremiah had written. He immediately launches into a prayer of intercession for his people. He realized that the 70-year allotment was over, and God needed to act on his promise. How can we tell he knew it was over? The wording he uses in his prayer shows this very clearly. He uses very immediate language. Now therefore, O our God, listen to the prayer of your servant and to his pleas of mercy. He reminds God that their predicament is ongoing, even though Babylon was no more. O my God, incline your ear and hear. Open your eyes and see our desolations, and the city that is called by your name. He finishes with some very pointed words. O Lord, pay attention and act. Delay not. Are those the words of someone who doesn't understand what he has been reading? No. Daniel understood at a deep level the plans and purposes of God, and he desired for God to fulfill his promises so that God would not be shown to be wrong in any way. God's reputation was at stake among all the people that he had warned through Jeremiah, and God sent Gabriel to give Daniel a personal answer to his prayer. It was a lot more than Daniel ever bargained for, I'm sure. So before Daniel was finished, Gabriel appears and Daniel notices he's visibly affected after trying to get there so fast. Almost out of breath. His first statement is that he has been sent to teach Daniel and make sure he understands what he is about to say. Understand everything and get a clear picture of the pattern that will be described. It all starts from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, the prince, Daniel 9:25. Many others read the word decree in the King James Version. Immediately, the search is on for when was a decree made regarding Jerusalem. There are 3 options usually considered. But are there really only 3 options? Let's look at what Ezra 6:14 says. They finished their building by decree of the God of Israel, and by decree of Cyrus, and Darius, and Artaxerxes, king of Persia. There are the 3 kings who made decrees, but notice that the God of Israel also made a decree. Why is it that no one investigates when that was done? Daniel contains the clue that it was not a human king who started the clock of the 70 weeks. I hinted at this earlier. The term that is used is Davar, or word, or utterance. Daniel never uses this word to describe a decree given by a king. Instead, he uses the word Dath to describe the decree of Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel 2:13, and by Darius in 6 verse 8 and 6 verse 12. Even earlier in Daniel 9, it states that Daniel was studying the books of Jeremiah and specifically the word of the Lord. Here the same word, Davar, is used to describe the utterance of God. I believe this is an example of where we need to carefully examine the usage of the words in the original language. So if the statement that starts the entire period of the 70 weeks is not anything to do with a decree given by a human king, and it is instead related to when God spoke his promise that Jerusalem and the land will be rebuilt and restored, when did that happen? When did the 70 weeks begin? Again, let us examine the exact words that are used by Gabriel. He states two specific words, Shuv and Bana. Shuv means to return or to come back to, and Bana is to rebuild. Daniel had been studying Jeremiah's writings very carefully and finally understood the significance of the 70 years related to Babylon. Now, Gabriel states that the Jewish people themselves and Jerusalem will have a period of 70. Not 70 years, but 70 weeks of years determined for them. Gabriel tells Daniel to go back to Jeremiah's writings and find where God promises that they will return to and rebuild Jerusalem. In Jeremiah 32 and 33, God tells Jeremiah to do something very peculiar. During the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem, the king had imprisoned Jeremiah in the palace dungeon for prophesying bad news. While there, God informs Jeremiah to expect his cousin to approach him and want to sell him some property. This Jeremiah does and has the deed signed and witnessed and sealed. He is then instructed to place this binding transaction along with an open property deed inside a clay jar so that they both will be preserved through the prophesied city's destruction. The reason given is, "For thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, houses and fields and vineyards shall again be bought in this land." Jeremiah 32:15. During a siege, no one could enter or leave, and the future of the people of Judah indeed looked grim. Even Jeremiah couldn't understand how it would be possible that the property he had just purchased would do him any good. He asked for understanding from God. God's response is in verses 26 to 44 and confirms that Jerusalem will be captured and completely demolished so that I will remove it from my sight. However, God promises two very important things. In Jeremiah 32:37, he states, "Behold, I will gather them from all the countries to which I drove them in my anger and my wrath, and in great indignation. I will bring them back to this place, and I will make them dwell in safety." And a few verses later, "For thus says the Lord, just as I have brought all this great disaster upon this people, so I will bring upon them all the good that I promised them. Fields shall be bought for money, and deeds shall be signed and sealed and witnessed in the land of Benjamin, in the places about Jerusalem, and in the cities of Judah, and in the cities of the hill country, in the cities of the Shephelah, and in the cities of the Negev. For I will restore their fortunes, declares the Lord." The phrase "restore their fortunes" is translated from the Hebrew Shuv. So here we have God specifically promising the exact same two concepts that Gabriel mentions in Daniel 9. God promises to let the Jewish people return to the land and to restore it. Even more significantly, in the next chapter, chapter 33, while he was still shut up in the court of the guard, verse 1, God states, Call to me, and I will answer you, and will tell you great and hidden things that you have not known. I will restore the fortunes of Judah and the fortunes of Israel, and rebuild them as they were at first. Jeremiah 33:3 and 7. Here, God uses the exact same two words that are used in Daniel 9. God will rebuild, or Bana, and he will restore, or Shuv. Daniel would have been able to seek this prophecy out in the writings of Jeremiah, and Jeremiah includes a specific date when this happened. Actually, he includes two dates, just so that there is no doubt of when it was. Jeremiah 32, verse 1, states that this happened in the 10th year of Zedekiah, king of Judah, which was the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar. This was in the year before the complete destruction of Jerusalem. It was 587 BC. This is the start of the 70 weeks that Gabriel told to Daniel. 7 weeks of years later, or 49 years later, is the year 538 BC. This was the first year of Cyrus the Great, king of Persia. Darius the Mede, who conquered Babylon, was king for only 1 year before Cyrus assumed control, and it was the year that Daniel was visited by Gabriel. However, 7 weeks from when God gave the word or promise that Jerusalem would have been or would be rebuilt and restored until an anointed one, a prince, is Cyrus the Great who takes over. Ezra records, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, and also put it in writing. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may his God be with him, yes, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. Here is the start of the fulfillment of God's promise that the people would be allowed to return and rebuild. Notice that Ezra specifically connects the fulfillment of God's promises to the books of Jeremiah. But how do we know that Cyrus is the anointed one that God promised? Isaiah contains the answer. Thus says the Lord, your Redeemer, who formed you from the womb. I am the Lord who made all things, who alone stretched out the heavens, who spread out the earth by myself, who confirms the word of his servant and fulfills the counsel of his messengers, who says of Jerusalem, she shall be inhabited, and of the cities of Judah, they shall be built, and I will raise up their ruins, who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he shall fulfill all my purpose, saying of Jerusalem, she shall be built, and of the temple, your foundation shall be laid. Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped, to subdue nations before him, and to loose the belts of kings, to open doors before him, that gates may not be closed. I will give you the treasures of darkness and the hoards in secret places, that you may know that it is I, the Lord, the God of Israel, who call you by your name. For the sake of my servant Jacob and Israel my chosen, I call you by your name. I name you, though you do not know me. I am the Lord, and there is no other. Besides me, there is no God. I equip you, though you do not know me. I have stirred him up in righteousness, and I will make all his ways level. He shall build my city and set my exiles free, not for price or reward, says the Lord of hosts. Isaiah prophesied this several hundred years before Cyrus was even born. Although the Bible does not state this, it seems very likely that Cyrus was made aware of Isaiah's long passage, which names him specifically. Notice that God refers to him as his anointed, just like Daniel 9 states. God predicts that Cyrus will set into motion the rebuilding of the temple, which in itself is the start of Jerusalem's restoration. God does not state that it will be completed under Cyrus, as only the temple's foundation will be laid. And that is exactly what happened. It was the start of a very contentious time where the people that returned faced extraordinary hardship to do any building projects. They would have to endure this for over 100 years before a very specific decree was given with absolute permission to rebuild the entire city as a whole. At that point, it is the start of the next period of weeks in Daniel 9. Gabriel lays out it very specifically as the start of a period of 62 weeks of years. However, that means there is a gap between the first set of weeks and the second set. It is an unspecified gap of years. This is something almost everyone has not noticed, especially those using English translations. This is what I showed in the previous presentation. Due to the fact that the King James Version translators chose to combine the first 7 weeks with the following 62 weeks in their text, most people have for hundreds of years not seen the proper original grammatical structure of this passage. Translations such as the English Standard Version, however, render the original language properly. Please investigate the Hebrew text to verify this absolutely essential fact. Without understanding this important point, the entire prophecy cannot be interpreted correctly. The last thing that I will point out is how God answered Daniel's amazing prayer on behalf of his people. In Daniel 9, verse 19, Daniel challenges God to pay attention and act, and delay not for your own sake. Gabriel told Daniel the 70 weeks had started and for him to search out when this had happened. Once Daniel went back to Jeremiah's writings and found the prophecy and the date, he knew that the first 49 years were almost up. He only had to wait until the following year when God's anointed one was made known and the fulfillment of God's promises took place. Consider the most common modern interpretation from Daniel's point of view. Most people lump the 70 weeks together with the 62 weeks and find fulfillment in Artaxerxes' decree of 444 BC as the start of the 70 weeks. Since Daniel is living in 538 BC and the fulfillment supposedly did not start until 444 BC, which is about 100 years later, God sure took his time in answering Daniel. Actually, Daniel would have been long dead by that time and would not witness any answer to prayer that Gabriel states specifically that he had been dispatched in haste to give Daniel. That is not the definition of an answer to prayer. Instead, God fulfilled Daniel's prayer during his lifetime, actually within the same year as his prayer. The proper way to understand the start of the 70 weeks is to realize that it was God himself who began the countdown with his promise that the people would again return and rebuild Jerusalem. He started the clock of the judgment of the Jewish people with the Babylonian 70 years of empire. He also started another clock with the return of the Jewish people and the promise of restoration with the 70 weeks of years. However, the 70 weeks have multiple phases of restoration. The reason that Gabriel split the 70 weeks of years into 3 sections is that each section shows a phase of restoration for the Jewish people. Daniel 9:24 contains the 6 stated goals for the period of 70 weeks. the completion of the punishment for Israel's rebellion, putting an end to sin, atoning for the misdeeds, to establish everlasting righteousness, to complete the prophecies which have been sealed, and to consecrate the most holy. These goals have partial fulfillment throughout the 70 weeks, but the final fulfillment does not take place until the entire 70 weeks is over. At the end of each separate period of weeks, there is fulfillment of some of the stated goals. At the end of the first 7 weeks, the restoration of Jerusalem and the temple's holy sanctuary is allowed. God's promises given at the start of the period are proven accurate. Although we have not discussed the following groups of weeks, the end of the 62 weeks shows the fulfillment of a Messiah who allows for the end of sin and atonement for wickedness. He establishes a new everlasting covenant with many. At the end of the final week, the new covenant joins with all the older covenants to find complete fulfillment. The time of punishment is at an end, and the Most Holy is completely revealed and consecrated. Jerusalem as God's city and those who have endured as God's chosen nation are redeemed. I realize that the information in this presentation contains an interpretation that is very much different from what is commonly stated. However, it is completely backed up with a proper understanding of the meanings and grammar of the original Hebrew language. That is something that most modern interpretations do not fully take into account. This presentation addresses the historical context of the period. It assumes a literal fulfillment of the prophecy and the common understanding of what a year means. It does not need a special prophetic 360-day year to work out. It allows for Daniel to experience God's answer to his prayer within his own lifetime, and it allows for a proper understanding for why the 70 weeks of years have been separated into 3 distinct periods of time. There is a lot of information contained here. There's even more that I just could not include for lack of time, which I will have to address in further presentations. However, in the next presentation, we'll look at the following 62 weeks of years and the significance of the first gap. Hope to see you there.